Great, thanks very much for that introduction, Rona, and thanks as well to the ITF for giving us the chance to present the findings of this research and compare and contrast with you all on the call. I will just put myself into full screen mode. Okay, I'm presenting this today, obviously, but it's in conjunction with my colleague, Greg Marsden, who will be on the call tomorrow in my stead, actually, and maybe a little bit of this afternoon as well. So also at the end of this presentation, which you'll see when you get the slides, are acknowledgements of our funders and also the wider members of the team who've obviously all contributed to this in many different ways over quite a difficult couple of years of trying to put this study together. So what is the study? What you see here is a map of what has been a multi-method longitudinal study starting from early on in the pandemic, and also trying, as you'll see with the quantitative data, to look retrospectively at some travel patterns pre-COVID to get a baseline. The top line there are the different waves of the quantitative household questionnaire survey, which is what I'll be concentrating on today. We have completed 3 waves, so that takes us up to examining behaviour until June of last year. The 4th wave is currently in the field at the moment, so we will have a contrast soon, but unfortunately not for today, from June last year to June this year. And we will be doing at least one other wave later this year, but it's looking likely that we may also get funding for next year as well. And it's a panel survey, so the participants that started the survey, just under 10,000 of them in the first wave, have continued on, with some topping up of the sample size as we go through, but largely we have a very healthy cohort that has answered all of the waves of the survey. The survey's been concentrated in 10 different locations in the UK. I'm not going to detail them now, but that will be revealed in a little while, in a few slides' time, so you can get an understanding of the locations. There is other research that goes alongside this with respect to qualitative interviews with householders, and also multiple waves of interviews with experts, so that is policymakers, local policymakers and transport operators. Clearly some of our interpretation is informed by those other aspects of data collection, but I haven't got time to go into those with you today. So as you'll see, we will be focusing on that aspect of the research. I'm going to just obviously give you a partial overview, but I've tried to pull out some headline figures really on what has changed in terms of the elements of travel behaviour that has changed and how, and then to try and give an impression of some of the diversity in terms of difference in changes that have taken place across different demographic segments, and also the locations that we've measured in the survey. I will finish by some very, very quick thoughts just to sort of whet your appetite on where some of our thinking about the implications of this is going. But of course, we've got plenty of time over the next couple of days to discuss that. I show also on this slide, by the way, just the website and the 3 main reports that we've put out with a lot more detail of what I'm about to tell you. Okay, so in terms of what has changed, this is just a descriptive slide to make sure that we keep in mind that when we're talking about changes, it's not just the normal things that we would focus on, i.e. the amount of car use and the amount with which people are using different modes of transport. We also need, in order to understand those changes, if nothing else, to think about the different destinations that people have discovered maybe or switched to, including some online virtual activity substitution for some of their mobility, the frequencies with which they're carrying out those journeys, and the timings of those journeys as well. All important aspects. Those all relate to a change in many respects in terms of the time that people are spending, the relative time that people are spending on different activities. Much of the discussion is focused on working from home and how that has meant a reconfiguration for a lot of people. around their lifestyles and their tendency to do things online or not online, etc. But there are things that we need to focus on that are not just about working from home, about the different lifestyles that people are maybe looking to try and achieve post-COVID. Car ownership levels. I think maybe there hasn't been enough understanding of just what the implications have been around people's relationship with their car when it was sitting idle for many hours on their driveway during COVID, affordability coming out of COVID, again, implications of working from home and the need for a car or at least a second car. Choices and aspirations of where to live, of course, they have huge implications on travel patterns going forward, and in terms of the degree to which COVID has had any implications on where people live, that is going to play out over the longer term. So we don't have anything we can really say about that at the moment, but it's something we will be looking at in future waves. And also, cutting across all of that are the social norms and expectations around mobility, and whether or not COVID has led to a re-evaluation of any kind around those. I won't be covering all of that ground, just to let you know. I've been quite selective. Here's the top line figures from our survey with respect to modal share. So these are the 4 waves. These are averages across the sample in each wave with respect to the proportion of people that use each mode at least 3 days a week. We could provide a metric, you know, of frequency of use in all kinds of different ways. We've chosen 3 days a week as being the metric that we use throughout quite a few of these slides. No great surprises here. I won't go into it in a huge amount of detail, although it would be interesting clearly to compare these figures, the general direction and scale and magnitude of the changes across different countries in different contexts. I think one of the main things to point out in our work has been around the active travel. So there's been an awful lot of focus on cycling and how COVID may have, you know, stoked an enthusiasm for cycling, certainly starting out at least with more leisure cycling during the lockdowns, and lots to understand about whether cycling is being sort of taken up, and there's been a shift in social norms around that. We in this survey have not found that, I would say, but we have lots to try and look at and understand, and I would say quite a good news story around walking, and I will go into that in a little bit more detail. This is just a different way of presenting what I showed you before, but in summary. So it's the proportion with which each individual mode has recovered vis-a-vis its pre-pandemic levels. So in the June 2021 survey, the car as a driver was back at around 85% of pre-pandemic levels. And at the time, that chimed very nicely with what we were seeing on the road in terms of traffic figures. I expect that will have increased somewhat when we get the data from this month. But what our traffic figures are showing here in the UK is that car use is still not back to pre-pandemic levels. Vans, HGVs are, and so overall traffic on the road is, but car as a driver, not so much. Again, you can see there that walking is the mode that has really consistently increased and is the only mode to be sitting at higher than its pre-pandemic levels. So on to walking then. We've looked at this in a variety of different ways through the study. We have some information about journey purposes. And it really is quite important to understand the degree to which that increase in walking was mainly around leisure, and as with cycling, as we were discussing, the degree to which that may then lead to a greater infiltration of walking into everyday lives and into utility travel. But certainly we can see that walking as a proportion of all the journeys that were undertaken, all the trips that were undertaken, was increased dramatically. There has been a small drop-off between October and June 2021. But going for a walk has actually been, implicated in a variety of different journey purposes, not just leisure. So you can see there that grocery shopping in particular has been a winner, and also to a certain extent travel to and from work. It is, as I will probably just keep saying a couple of times, of course, right now is a very, very important juncture for all kinds of reasons, to capitalise and on what we found, on the changes that we found, and progress the positive trends. But really, it is what happens over the next few months as economies are bouncing back, hopefully, that we really need to watch out for and figure out who is doing what and where. So, as I said before, in order to try and interpret some of these changes and understand what the direction of travel might be going forward, we could really do with a greater understanding of how people are spending their time. And if people are working from home and not traveling as much, what are they spending that traveling time on? Is it different types of travel? Likewise, with respect to online shopping and other kinds of activities that have switched online, what is that time being spent on other forms of travel or other forms of activity? Oh, I forgot there was animation on that slide. That always catches you out, doesn't it, when you've forgotten? So, as I say, this isn't from our research. This is the traffic data that we were seeing up until January of this year, split into weekdays and weekends. This is total traffic, so isn't just car travel, but total traffic. 100% of pre-pandemic levels were reached already by last summer, particularly though, or only though, last summer in the summer of 2020 at weekends. By last summer, that was the same, but weekend travel was even more intense. So the changing of timing across the week there is very important, and that pattern follows is particularly stark when you look at car traffic. So when we talk about the degree to which car traffic has bounced back, it is actually really important to understand this phenomena around leisure travel and how COVID has reconfigured the degree to which people are maybe not using their cars so much during the week, a lot of that being to do with working from home, but there's a kind of a bounce back, if you like, to using the car and more intense utilisation of the car at weekends. But working from home is a key factor. If what I said earlier suggested that I thought it wasn't important, I hope not. Of course, it's tremendously important. So pre-pandemic, this is from our work, and it parallels nicely with a lot of the statistics we see on a national basis. So pre-pandemic, 78% of the sample did no working from home at all. That went down at its lowest amount to 34%, so just a third of the sample right in the early lockdown. It's now around 50-50, so still 50% of our sample last June at least were working from home at least some of the time. When we work, we have obviously data for how people commuted before COVID, the length of their commute and the mode with which they commuted and the number of days they commuted on. We produced a number of scenarios around if at least 50% of people of the working from home that was being done in June last year continued. So about 50% of people were working from home at least some of the time last June. If 50% of that amount of working from home continued into the future, we could work out the percentage reduction in commute trips and miles saved by each of the modes. And in the headline, obviously, is around car travel. When we're thinking about congestion and carbon emissions, we can see there that that's at around 16% reduction in additional percentage reduction in miles, so that's additional to the working from home savings in car use that were taking place pre-COVID, around 16% additional reduction. But I think the important thing to take away from this slide is that working from home is going to impact all modes, as we know, and this is and including active travel, and this is something which we are all grappling with in different ways as operators or policymakers. So working from home has an impact on car commuting, though, not just for the journey for work. This is what our survey is showing quite strongly. It's having an impact on the degree to which the car is used overall for all journey purposes. So the table there, you can see a contrast in the average days a week on which the car is driven, contrasting those people who don't work from home at all to those that do it partially, so less than 100%, and those that do it fully. And you can see there's a decimal point missing in that last one, that's 1.65, sorry. You can see that there's really quite a steep decline in the amount with which the car is used overall, according to the amount of working from home. And that's the same if we look at change over time. So look at following the individuals through the sample and looking at those that increased their working from home, but also changed their levels of car use. We can see that those that increased their working from home reduced their car use the most, i.e. by 41%. Those that decreased their working from home are the least likely, or almost the least likely, to have reduced their car use. So again, looking at it in absolute terms, or whether we look at the churn in individual lifestyles over time related to working from home, we can see that there's a strong association there. The same with respect to shopping. So this is some data looking at the degree to which online shopping was increased, whether it was for grocery delivery, supermarket delivery, or other types of, whether it was for going to the supermarket, physically traveling to the supermarket, or having virtual deliveries. We can see that those who worked from home were the most likely to have reduced their physical travel to the supermarket, and the most likely to have got home deliveries. The impact on transport is going to be really quite significant. So looking at the change over time in different for different mode users, we can, and contrasting buses outside of London to buses to rail, but bus and rail users within London or outside of London. We can see really quite a contrast over time with respect to the amount of bounce back in those modes. I wanted to just ponder, before I just go on to a couple of differences across locations, to what I said earlier about the levels of car ownership. Because this is a panel study, again, we've been able to follow different households over time with respect to the amount of cars in their households, and also looking at a change in household size and trying to control for that as well. These figures are trying to sort of summarise that change over time. So contrasting the changes from June 2020, so the first wave, to our last wave, wave 4 in June last year, looking at the proportion of households who own different numbers of cars, and understanding the degree to which those changes have taken place among those households. So just to try and explain, overall, on average, the sample went from 20.5% of households not owning a car to 20.9% of households not owning a car. So a very slight increase in the proportion of households not owning a car. However, there was some churn under that. 90% of those households stayed the same. 10% of those households did actually acquire a car. So 10% of non-car owning households did acquire a car. By far the biggest amount of change that took place was from 2-car owning households down to 1-car owning households. You can see that 14% of 2-car owning households reduced their car fleet, if you like, in the household to one car. This is really quite a significant change, and if we try and understand or relate that to the data that we're seeing in terms of car sales, second-hand car sales, certainly there are supply constraints in with respect to new cars on the market, and that is explaining some of the reduction in the numbers of sales of cars that have been taking place. And this is not just a UK phenomenon. But there is something in here about the changing in working patterns also impacting the numbers of cars in a household, and trying to focus on that 2-car household down to 1-car household could be a really, really important point for policymakers to push on. So who and where has changed? Clearly, there have been different responses in different places. And we can look at that according to demographics in those places, so the labour market, the public transport offer, and also if we could get a few more sophisticated measures around this, there's something culturally and attitudinally that differs from place to place that I think may have a bearing on some of the patterns that we're seeing and some of the diversity. We must try and understand who has been impacted, who has found some of these changes easier to make than others, and who certainly, as we go now into a further crisis in terms of cost of living and fuel price increases, really understanding that adaptability and the capacity to adapt, I think, is crucial. We've found differences according to individual health risk, which is certainly very pertinent throughout the COVID pandemic. But just to say that we correlated our location data with the degree to which different locations had been impacted by COVID, the degree to which they had restrictions and different lengths of lockdown, but also the degree to which the pandemic prevalence and mortality rates, and we didn't find any difference. So I think important to understand those health risks, but interesting that the actual lockdown context didn't seem to have an impact in and of itself with respect to the differences that we're seeing across locations. But certainly, just to sort of summarise all of that, and the things that we will be talking about, I think our data certainly does show that we will need really quite specific policy responses, place by place, and also segment by demographic segment. So that you get an indication of the locations. It's very difficult when we've chosen 10 locations to really try and explain the nature of these locations for those of you that don't know. They are all, there's an urban bias to our sample is the most important thing for you to know. They're all based on cities or large towns, and many of the samples are actually at the city regional level. So we have London in there, but we also have some of our larger cities in the UK, Liverpool, Manchester and Newcastle, and also in Scotland, Glasgow, Edinburgh and Aberdeen. And with respect to the other locations that you see there, Ayrshire and Lancaster, they are the more rural locations in our sample, but also on quite a regional basis, adding up to the hinterland, if you like, either Ayrshire with respect to Glasgow and Lancashire with respect to the Manchester, making up a regional perspective. Doesn't matter where you look across those different regions, car traffic by last year had not bounced back to normal. I can't again go into total detail all the differences that you're seeing on this slide, the headlines being that some modes are more variable than others across locations. So in particular, if you look at rail travel there, you can see the difference in bounce back, if you like. So train being much more likely to have bounced back early in Bristol, and in Newcastle. We think that's likely to do to the nature of employment market in those areas, and Bristol being somewhere that's very much not quite on the commuter line to London, but has big connections business-wise, and lots of travel to and from London for those purposes. But also cycling is very variable there, lots of variation, maybe partly a commute story, again, to do with the local labour market in those areas, and also in student populations, also likely to reflect the local conditions where people live. We don't think, however, that this cycling story that we're seeing here is really a sort of place-based, location specific in terms of looking at the different towns and cities. That's because in none of the places apart from London that we have studied is there a decent sort of extensive cycling network to contrast with those places that don't. So it's more likely to be in relation specifically to where the respondents in our sample are living. And bus also, just to focus on that, we know that with bus travel, it's very associated with demographics, and that age matters in particular. In the UK, the bounce back to bus use, in as much as there has been one, unfortunately, we're seeing that the older population are the ones that are not returning to bus travel in such greater numbers. But there is some patterning in here related to where the largest student cohorts existed and the increases in bus travel that we're seeing. So a huge amount in that slide, and just to give you a flavour of some of the diversity that we're seeing. But it is relevant to look at those changes in relation to working from home. And we did a lot of detailed study in wave 3, not picking up on the wave 4 data, but waves 1, 2 and 3, to understand who was working from home and how that related to spatial characteristics. Some really important things that we found. Firstly, that those that moved across to working from home were more likely to have been cycling and train commuters pre-pandemic. So those that couldn't or didn't or couldn't work from home during COVID and possibly since were more car dependent with respect to the commute beforehand. So there is a diversity there with which to think about the extent to which working from home is really going to impact car commuting. But also those that couldn't work from home, we found to live in more car dependent areas more generally, so more likely to be on the edge of cities where journey commute lengths or certainly commute times were longer. And there were poorer access to other alternatives modes of transport to the car. So sort of a locking in of car dependence and a real picture of those with choice to work from home, or when they commute, choice of other modes versus people in certain types of jobs, living in certain types of locations where they have neither the choice to work from home nor to use something other than the car. And these levels of working from home were very uneven before COVID. So, that it's no great surprise. Here you have a mapping within our sample of the types of employment sector that people were living in and also the type of location. So we've broken our sample locations down according to a standard classification of types of areas, from cosmopolitan area to deep rural area, and also mapped the degree to which the sample in those areas were working in different types of economic sector. And although working from home was widespread in all the sectors studies, that it still contrasted at its lowest in the sparsely populated areas at 28% of the working population in the sample, up to 68% in London. And you can see when you actually get your eye into that graph that's very much related to the job sectors. So those places that had the greatest working from home had the greatest proportion of the sample working in those sectors with the most working from home. Okay, so just to finish off then, in terms of demographic characteristics, you might be pleased to know I haven't got lots of graphs to bombard you with on this because there are far too many, but these are just the headlines. So we found this difference, as I say, with respect to health risk. So shielding households were most likely to start online grocery shopping. Ethnic minorities are most likely to continue using buses. With respect to gender differences, unfortunately, we didn't see any levelling up in terms of who took up cycling. So the extent to which cycling did increase, it still tended to be the males that were more likely to have increased their cycling, and therefore still keeping that difference between the genders as we go forward. But again, with respect to walking, I think it is important to say that we found very few differences with respect to who did and who didn't walk, with the exception of those with mobility impairments, obviously. And so walking became something that that everyone started to or increased their use of during the pandemic. So to conclude then, I think with just a sort of few ideas to maybe think about, structure some of the discussion as we go through this workshop. Certainly, I think whatever changes we have seen, it's a really sort of false narrative to think about going back to normal, or the idea that anything will indeed go back to normal. The pandemic can't be unlearnt. It's happened. There have been some very significant changes, and it's a matter of really trying to lock in the positive changes that we've seen, but also to understand the diversity in terms of inequality and the gap opening up between places and people who have the capacity to change and not change. There are new working arrangements being established. This is different according to where people live. So again, some real diversity in opportunity. But that new working arrangement has not just had an impact on the mode, but it's had an impact on the different activities that people are carrying out across the week in their lifestyles, and changing the whether it's the weekly pattern, this weekday mode, or the pattern across the day, even start and finish times. We've got to think about how different actors are responsible for trying to, as I say, lock in some of these positive benefits, and in particular with respect to working from home, what is the employer-employee package that will really optimise their ability to have the flexibility that they need, but also we can think about the implications for the transport operators, including also, of course, for business travel. But people have adapted in terms of the childcare routines, the way they've changed the space in their houses, the number of cars that they need as a household, caring responsibilities, the way they shop, where they go to the gym. So all of these types of activities need to be considered for us to think about what the future trajectories might be. And as I say, just a final slide to acknowledge the funders and my teammates on this. So thank you.